Pumping iron was a notable point of first contact for many to the world of bodybuilding. But it's an idealized representation of a subculture that, in the words of its own producer, missed something crucial by failing to show bodybuilding's true complexity. The individuality of the men, the arduous training, the tension of a contest, the thrill of winning, and the desolation of losing broaden the viewer's appreciation of the sport and the men involved in it. But we leave the topic entertained without really learning much about it. Pumping Iron focuses on the sport's who's, what's, and why's, rather than the how's, in a carefully crafted narrative deliberately designed to gloss over the numerous negative stereotypes and associations held by the public at that time. We're witness to Arnold lighting up an illegal joint, but no mention, incidental or otherwise, of the legal PEDs, which were by then an undeniably inseparable part of the sport. And as much as the idea of bodybuilding repulsed the general public, it was also ironically the drug-enhanced bodies featured in Pumping Iron that ushered the sport into the eyes of the mainstream. But critiquing the film on that count may well be like, in the words of one reviewer, faulting a superior close-up photograph of a leaf because it fails to show the whole tree. But the PED issue is still worth addressing, since it's the unresolved and literally ignored 800-pound gorilla in the room. The 1960s and 70s counterculture philosophically opened the door to wider cultural drug use, and bodybuilding was pulled along in the jet stream of its own rapid evolution, supercharged by the emerging technologies of biochemistry. And while the 60s and 70s are generally referred to nostalgically as the golden era of bodybuilding, it certainly wasn't viewed that way by many at the time. And although the origins of PEDs go back even further than this free-spirited experimental era, there was a seismic shift in the atmosphere in the world of bodybuilding, signalling the collapse of many of the foundational ideals that physical culture was built on. Pumping Iron marked the dawning of the fitness boom that would popularize both bodybuilding and bodybuilders as the fitness craze swept across an awakening health-conscious world. At the time of the film's inception, however, drugs were already a long-established component of the sport. But identifying when PEDs infiltrated bodybuilding is a journey through historically muddy waters. While some delineate bodybuilding across arbitrary perceptual eras like the Bronze, Silver, and Golden era, perhaps stated more accurately, these eras should be divided between the natural and the enhanced. By 700 BC, the ancient Greeks were already aware that heightened testosterone would increase performance. With no syringes or hormones in injectable liquid form, athletes instead gorged on animal hearts and testicles in search of performance enhancement. Squibb Pharmaceuticals began funding research on synthetic testosterone in 1926, and by the mid-1930s, 3 drug makers were racing to synthesize mass-producible testosterone. Ciba chemist Leopold Rusica won the sprint and obtained the first patent for addressing artificial testosterone in 1935, along with sharing pharmaceutical scientist Adolf Butenandt. In 1939, Rusica received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for his testosterone work. Despite no concrete evidence, there's a high probability that Germany was using testosterone as early as the 1936 Olympics, and military personnel during World War II. Hitler himself was using testosterone propionate. Steroids were used to reverse the wasted conditions of concentration camp survivors, and the performance benefits derived from Nazi data were already well known. So for a military not averse to using amphetamines to drive their blitzkrieg, why wouldn't they employ testosterone to enhance their military's performance? I'm aware of the existence of a single article dispelling the myth of PED-assisted Nazi super soldiers, but this article is just as speculative without applying a whole lot of logical inference, and it's just flat out wrong in places. While I don't think German units were carrying or using testosterone as part of their wartime field kits, I believe that there would have been at least some medical testing analysing the potential benefits of testosterone in terms of combat performance and wound recovery, given the information known at the time. Ziegler definitely had some of this data through his Ciba connections. Was every piece of research obtained from the often destroyed files of the Nazis? I hate to invoke the logical fallacy of absence of evidence not indicating evidence of absence, but applying some logical inference to probability, I'm leaning towards the belief that there was at least some experimental application on the military, but that's just my thoughts. Even pharmaceutical company Ciba had a broader market in mind than just convalescing patients in the medical community, and endorsed testosterone aimed directly at bodybuilders as early in the 1940s. Famed bodybuilder and Olympic weightlifter John Grimek was already corresponding with a Dr. B. Jeffs as far back as 1943, inquiring about the effects of methyl testosterone. This represents a 16-year gap between his letter and Ziegler's launch of Dianabol in 1959, so it's foolish to think that there was no other steroid activity other than Ziegler's tinkering with Grimek and other York lifters in the mid-1950s. Now, I discussed more about Ziegler in my previous video on my documentary review of Bigger, Stronger, Faster, but John Bosley Ziegler, a former US Marine turned scientist working with Ciba Pharmaceuticals, used Nazi documentation to develop the less androgenic Dianabol to facilitate the rehab of wounded patients. Ziegler speculated that if this new drug could accelerate growth in unhealthy or injured patients, what benefits could this confer on healthy athletes? Fitness fanatic Ziegler approached York Barbell to test the product on its athletes, giving Grimek a half-bushel basket full of pills and the task of finding some volunteers. By 1954, Grimek was taking a number of Ziegler's experimental drugs, including testosterone and Syndrox. He wasn't the lone guinea pig and was joined by York members Yas Kazuhara and 1952 Mr. America Jim Park. Ziegler wanted the athletes to adhere to no more than 15 milligrams of Dianabol per day. The drugs were cycled 6 weeks on, 5 days off, with periodic liver testing. The initial results, based on Grimek's written feedback, weren't great. Grimek wrote, "Ziegler tried to convince me that if I took these shots 2 or 3 times a week, I'd get stronger and more muscular without training, but I saw no reaction. In fact, I told him that I was feeling lousy compared to what I felt normally, so he suggested I return to training. I did, but after weeks I gave up the shots. I got no results." Raised on the Horatio Alger work ethic, there was a naive innocence where no one believed that these little pills would make you a star overnight. Hard work, sacrifice, and physical training were the traits fueling success, not some pills. It just didn't seem possible. One of Ziegler's guinea pigs, Bill March, explained, "I thought it was just another vitamin, but I would have done anything." Grimek's repeated self-experiments and correspondence continued. "Sorry to report, no change, no improvement, no nothing. If anything, I'm worse. Both shoulders hurt and I'm unable to do any exercises. They haven't been this sore in ages. I don't know what happened or how they got this miserable." And he also wrote later in the 1960s, "How's the anabolic working for you? It does nothing for me. The fellows claimed it did nothing for them, yet each of them did good or better than they've done in the past, in spite of losing. I haven't discussed it with Hoffman yet, as to how much he gave and to whom, to see if those who took it were the ones who did better than the past." On the other hand, weightlifter Tony Garcia added 100 pounds to his lifts in 3 months, but he wasn't convinced it was entirely the drugs, instead attributing it to Tommy Kono's training and dedication to mental focus and technique. He did state, however, that, "I'm amazed at the constant state of euphoria and energy I have. I don't know whether it's the workouts, the pills, or the delight I have over my progress." 1959 represented the changing of the guard. It was the year the original Muscle Beach closed, and the initial stages of Ziegler's more widespread experiments using the newly formulated Dianabol with York athletes. Hoffman himself began taking Dianabol late in 1960 at age 62, in which he noticed an increase in his strength over 6 weeks, but unimpressed, he stated he never used them again. Hoffman haphazardly administered steroids to a number of his weightlifters for the 1960 Olympics, but despite some improvements to individual results, the Soviet lifters still crushed the US team, and no one came back with a clear reading of whether anabolic steroids enhanced performance or not. Although synthesized in the West, the Soviets had been using testosterone since the 40s in government-sanctioned systematic athletic programs, so they were already light years ahead of the West in terms of understanding the use of these drugs by the 60s. And a large part of the confusion regarding the drug's efficacy was due to Ziegler's irregular and uncontrolled research methods. Along with the drugs, Ziegler was also testing out his theories of functional isometric exercise along with hypnotism. It was a conglomeration of methods that was impossible to tell where the impact of one ended and another began. By the late 1960s, however, many lifters and athletes knew that they had something and were dosing the drugs far beyond Ziegler's recommendation of the initial 5 to 10 milligram doses that Ziegler prescribed. They began stacking these oral doses with other injectable steroids in a new chemical arms race. Most of the steroids that we know today were produced between 1958 and 1964 under less stringent government regulations. The start of the 1950s saw the first commercial protein powders and ended with the insurgence of the infinitely more powerful anabolic steroids. It was a fitting comparison for the natural yielding to the evolving technology of the synthetic. The question over whether Steve Reeves and Reg Park ever used steroids has attracted a ton of speculation, rumours and accusations over the years. Reeves was famously quoted as saying, "I don't believe in bodybuilders using steroids. If a man doesn't have enough male hormones in his system to create a nice, hard, muscular body, he should probably take up ping pong." Reg Park was similarly outspoken against the use of PEDs throughout his life. Both men competed at the 1950 NABBA Mr. Universe, and both would go on to fill the role of Hercules in future movies. 2 years prior, a young Steve Reeves was bested by a 38-year-old John Grimmick at the 1948 Universe in London. Reeves was later invited to train with Grimmick and the York Gang in 1950, with Grimmick mentioning how he and the fellows didn't think Reeves had a snowflake's chance in hell of winning that upcoming 1950 Universe. Grimmick was impressed by Reeves' work ethic and Reeves' ability to literally transform before his eyes in his time spent at York. Steve, who enjoyed prodigious amounts of time off from the gym, nevertheless had an uncanny ability to whip himself into condition in a matter of weeks when it counted. So did he use PEDs to aid this transformation? Although there's nothing concrete to suggest he did, if there was ever an environment and a bunch of fellows that could assist Reeves' efforts with some chemical assistance, it definitely would have been Grimmick and the York crew. You have to remember the perception of steroids in the context of this time period. They were viewed as something benign, both morally and legally, and no one knew the full effects of their health ramifications. There was no judgment attached to these drugs as something equating cheating or wrongdoing. There was no sophisticated use of understanding of what these drugs did beyond anecdotal hearsay. The medical consensus was that drugs didn't aid strength or muscle gain, and at best they were considered some kind of supervitamin, equivalent to the newly emerging protein powder or liver tablets. It seems strange that many of the era's guys were so morally discerning regarding something that no one knew anything about, besides a lot of retroactive moralizing to the contrary. In saying that, in the late 40s and early 50s, the anabolic menu options were pretty limited. There was no Dianabol Nilevar yet. Maybe Reeves dabbled here and there throughout his career, but dabbling doesn't make you a steroid user. Reeves also reportedly did gay for pay, but that likewise doesn't make Reeves a homosexual. At the end of the day, there's no hard and fast evidence for either possibility, just the balance of probability. I'd say on this scale, Reeves didn't use steroids in any kind of systematic, effective manner, but that doesn't mean he didn't at least give them a good old try.
Yeah, that's the thing, you see. During my time, I believe that bodybuilding was a health-oriented sport, where now it's unhealthy, chemical-induced gains and all that. I believe if your genetic background didn't give you the hormones to build the kind of body you wanted without injecting other hormones into your body, you should take up some other sport like, I don't know, catching butterflies, ping pong, or whatever, you know.
Would you have ever taken steroids, even if you were
No,
available?
never, because it's not health-oriented. Yeah. I mean, I plan to live to be 100. I don't know if I'll make it, but I'm going to try. And that there would get me dead at 65 probably.
The Herculean Reg Park was considered a monster for his time, ushering in a new standard of size for the era. Park has always maintained his lifetime natural status, which has been defended by his son John in many interviews after Reg's passing. I think, like Steve Reeves, it's doubtful Park used steroids with any regularity or consistency. There weren't any huge fluctuations in size and appearance throughout Park's career. Park also travelled to the US and worked for Weider, who definitely had the medical connections for his stable of guys. But I think this was too early in the piece for Reg to have tried. Park was a lifelong mentor for the young Schwarzenegger, who had absolutely no qualms with using drugs, so it seems dubious that Reg would have dismissed them out of hand, given the meteoric rise of this new prodigy Schwarzenegger. Considering the bodybuilder psychology, it also seems odd that Park wouldn't have at least tried them, given their morally neutral and health benign status. There's not a bodybuilder in history whose ego likes to be bested in the forum of public competition. So when Park and Arnold faced off in 1970, it seems highly plausible that Reg, the teacher, wouldn't have pulled out all the stops to serve his young apprentice Schwarzenegger a lesson. This is just my thoughts and not the facts, of course, so let me know yours in the comments. Reg Park's son, John, also pursued bodybuilding in a natural capacity, following in his father's footsteps, travelling to America and training under the steroid-using Bob Paris. But despite all the athletic promise and potential in the world, John was an Olympic swimmer, he couldn't obtain even a fraction of his father's size despite the updated knowledge, equipment, guidance, nutrition, and supplementation. If the two were cut from the same cloth and both lifetime naturals, why the discrepancy? Maybe Reg just visualised it better. I'm speaking tongue-in-cheek here, of course, but given the bodybuilder proclivity for lies, half-truths, omissions, exaggerations, and faulty memories, it seems the facts sometimes get diluted in the retelling. In part 2, I'll expand on Butler and Gaines's reasoning for this retroactive and defensive hypocrisy. While filming a movie for Arthur Jones in 1958, bodybuilder Bill Pearl stated that Jones informed him of a new chemical that the Russians were using to improve their strength. Investigating for himself, he met a vet who told him that the steroids were being used to develop strength and growth in cattle. The name of the drug was Nilevar, and the recommended human dose was 10 milligrams. Nilevar was available 2 years before Dianabol, and the young Pearl, throwing caution to the wind, expressed, "Good enough for a bull, good enough for me." He immediately began using 3 times the recommended amount, 30 milligrams for 3 months. Pearl experienced rapid gains in a short time, convinced this wasn't a placebo. In 12 weeks, his weight shot up from 225 to 250 pounds, with his strength breaking his previous 600-pound squat barrier. These were significant gains because Pearl, already built at 225 pounds at 5'10" before steroids, even at this advanced level was still able to gain an additional 25 pounds in 12 weeks. Bill acknowledged discomfort at this weight and reportedly discontinued the drug soon after. He said he used PEDs for his contest preps in 1958 and 1961, but he claimed that he won the 1967 and 1971 titles completely drug-free. This seems doubtful because in 1971 he was in better shape, claiming not only drug-free status but also meat-free after switching to a lacto-vegetarian diet, defeating Reg Park, Frank Zane and Sergio Oliva in his very controversial final competition. Pearl continued to be very inconsistent with his stories over the years, and when questioned on the topic of steroids, said that he only took PEDs for science in 1958 and never for competition, while at other times he said he first took steroids for the 1967 universe. By 1959, steroids had also infiltrated high school football, with Charles Yasala stating in the book Spiral of Denial that doctors brought steroids into football, equating them as benign supervitamins to players at the time. A clandestine experiment conducted by a 1960s pharmaceutical company in cooperation with the team's physician administered 3 different commercial brands of steroids to 10th and 11th grade high school football players to test the efficacy of the drugs along with any potential side effects. This bizarrely unethical experiment was halted only once other coaches caught wind of it. In 1963, weightlifter Elvin Roy, dubbed football's first strength coach, became a trainer for the San Diego Chargers NFL team. Applying Ziegler's research to the football training camp, Seba's pink Dianabol pills began appearing in bowls at the Chargers' breakfast tables to help players recover from then what was a cutting-edge NFL weight training regime. As steroids aside, this was an innovative move, considering the widespread belief at the time that weight training would compromise performance and leave athletes muscle-bound. Steroids soon after became the norm in college and pro football programs everywhere, while in local gyms lifters could not get their hands on enough Dianabol. Unsurprisingly, the side effects of this chemical warfare were becoming manifest, with a now regretful Ziegler expressing his frustration at opening Pandora's anabolic box expressing, "These simple-minded shits. I wish to God I'd never done it. I'd like to go back and take that whole chapter out of my life." On a similar note, Grimmick admitted in a 1964 Muscular Development that the drugs worked but warned of the potential dangers. He then later reversed himself in a 1967 Health and Strength, stating that drugs aren't needed for bigger muscles. Bodybuilding journalist Rick Wayne later asked Grimmick if he had used steroids, and Grimmick, preempting Mike O'Hearn by 50 years, declared, "Terrible stuff. I've never used them, nor have any of the fellows we train at York." Wayne reminded Grimmick of an article in Sports Illustrated quoting Ziegler's experiments with York Barbell's club members, but Grimmick neither confirmed nor denied the report. Grimmick further insisted that he had never taken drugs of any kind as part of his program, depending instead on wholesome food, Hoffman's supplements, and the York courses. And it wasn't just Grimmick who rejected the effectiveness of steroids. Declared as fool's gold by an oblivious medical community, officially declaring drugs as ineffective in promoting strength and muscle gains, it totally contradicted the results now being experienced by the bigger and more vascular athletes appearing on the scene in the 1960s. Dianabol and other steroids were required to contain a printed medical insert stating that these drugs offered no benefit to the promotion of strength and muscle mass, but of course the athletes blazing their own trail knew better. While amphetamines were banned at the Olympics in 1968, steroids totally escaped similar prohibition. This only further damaged the credibility of the medical field due to its obvious contradiction of the reality that these drugs worked. Denial coupled with ambivalence became the standard operating procedure for most of the muscle industry media, who saw the marketing opportunities open up by this new wave of chemical enhancement. Although philosophically opposed, Hoffman needed stronger weightlifters and Weider bigger bodybuilders. Both camps realized early on that steroids were an entity they couldn't control or market, so it was easier to turn a blind eye and capitalize on, rather than fighting the inevitable. Both Weider and Hoffman were visionary in playing both sides of the fence. They downplayed the true efficacy of steroids, while promoting the effectiveness of their supplements and equipment in the same breath. An article from Weider in 1963 on the efficacy of Dianabol warned readers of its potential dangers while simultaneously positioning his crash weight gain formula as an alternative 3 times more effective than Dianabol. Weider also had the absolute goal of using steroid-enhanced athletes to promote this blatant deception. In a rare moment of candor, Weider stated, "My job was to pull as many young boys off the street and into the gym as I could, using the advertising that I did. By the time you realized it was bullshit, I already had you hooked into a healthier lifestyle, working out and eating better." Hoffman, no friend of Weider's, likewise played the same game. He stated in one of his 1968 issues that the top athletes weren't using steroids, dismissing the drugs as no help for the advanced bodybuilder. He, like Weider, instead positioned his supplements as more safe and effective alternatives. But it was getting harder to deny the undeniable. Drugs were key, and by the end of the 60s, the mainstream media were calling out steroids as the breakfast of champions. Athletes across all fields were seeking any possible advantage over their competitors, and became embroiled in a game of chemical one-upmanship. As one Olympic shot putter poetically stated in his short ode to Dianabol, "Dianabol, Dianabol, it's the gateway to fame. With Dianabol you'll win them all, unless the others are doing the same." The champions of the sport were just as protective with their image and equally opaque in their disclosure regarding how they built their physiques. Arnold, Franco and Zane consistently skirted or minimized the drug issue, while bodybuilder Boyer Coe maintained a level of open honesty throughout all of his competitive career regarding drug use. Beginning his journey in 1959 at the age of 15, Boyer built up a respectable amount of strength and size, setting a personal goal to bench press 400 pounds and squat 500 by the time he graduated high school. He had heard about Dianabol while training with college football players, and he thought he'd use it to break his lifting plateau. Paying $5 for a bottle of 100 tabs, he began taking 5 milligrams per day, but saw little weight gain. He did, however, see his bench press skyrocket, shooting up to 420 pounds and he was squatting 500 barefoot at 17 years of age before graduation. Boyer began taking pre-med college courses in 1964, and he recalls that even by then, everyone on campus was taking Dianabol. 1965 represented a banner year for bodybuilding. Arnold went AWOL to compete in the Junior Mr. Europe, meeting Franco and Albert Busek for the first time. Joe Gold opened Gold's Gym, and Larry Scott became the first Mr. Olympia on a self-admitted cycle amounting to a minimal 10 milligrams of Dianabol. That same year, Dave Draper won the 1965 Mr. America in arguably his best shape ever, using Winstrol. Dave was already 10 years into training, 235 pounds, a winner of the Mr. America, before using drugs, but noticed a marked improvement in my muscularity and separation. He also realized the big catch to using these drugs: a marked loss of improvement when he stopped taking them. In a later interview, Draper also stated that between 1965 and 1970, a reasonable 12-week cycle would consist of Deca at 1 cc per week, plus Winstrol, Anavar, or Dianabol in pill form, 4 to 6 tabs a day. Levels would be higher or lower according to results, need, or the rascal's daring, ignorance, desperation, ingredient availability, their mood, etc. Every 6 weeks during the non-competition season, a short and light cycle might be engaged to sustain muscle and strength. Now, whether Draper was speaking from personal experience having used this combination or was speaking generally isn't stated, but he cautioned younger lifters against PED use in his book Brother Iron and Sister Steel. Young bodybuilders, if you're not taking them, don't. If you do, you'll wish you never did. They'll eat away at the foundations you're trying to build before you build them. Draper nostalgically reflected that the pre-steroid days were awash in the fundamentals, the magic not derived from the pharmacist but instead the soul, the era, the history in the making, and the presence of uncompromised originality yet to be initiated. Other icons caught at this chemical crossroads from that era recounted similar sentiment. Bob Geyer, working with Rio Blair, was disclosed the real secrets of bodybuilding, referring to steroids. The advice he received was to take 5 milligrams of Dianabol daily, then 10, then 15, and keep continuing until I began to bleed from the nose. So I said to myself, no fucking way. Don Howarth had heard about Pearl's Nilevar experiment. Don had already built himself up to 232 pounds without any drugs, but trimmed down to 190 when he decided to try Dianabol for the first time under Rio Blair's guidance. He was told to forget about getting stronger, but you'll get bigger. And after 3 weeks of using, he reported no size gains, but his bench went from 350 to 380 pounds. For the 1967 Junior Mr. America, Howarth added 5 to 10 milligrams of Dianabol to his daily diet of 2 to 3 cups of Rio Blair's protein, 0.9 litres of raw cream, 2 pounds of ground sirloin, and daily 3 dozen eggs. 10 days out from the show, Rio removed the Dianabol, adding instead sublingual testosterone along with a measure of wine to bring out the vascularity on show day. Don went on to compete in his best shape of his life, and he won the overall. Howarth later recounted his experience. Cycles were governed mainly by fear more than anything else. Ball shrinkage, that stuff bothered me, and lots of guys taking much more, but the amount I took was a joke compared to today. Don could foresee the Faustian commitment required for this new era of bodybuilding, so he too walked away from the sport. Chet Yorton was not only one of 3 men in history to beat Arnold, but he was reportedly natural while doing so. Yorton was a committed lifetime natural who would eventually start his own tested federation in 1975, and he vehemently defended his and others' drug-free honour at the 1966 Mr. Olympia contest when he took issue with Larry Scott after an exhibition, when Larry addressed an audience question asking him if he takes steroids. Sure, doesn't everyone, he admitted. They've become a regular part of bodybuilding in the States. Yorton, standing in the sidelines, took exception and the two exchanged words on stage and later at a party. I don't know a single American champion who has ever taken drugs as part of his training, said Yorton. You can't beat good steaks and quality supplements. A taken aback Scott replied, "Ah, come on, Shed," he said, "you know better than that." Ironically, both men walked away from competition in 1966, but later re-emerged in the late 70s. By the end of the 1950s, many were stacking bolesterone, drostanolone, maxibolon, halotestin, nilovar, anavar, anadrol, winstrol, and primobolan. Rio Blair had sublingual testosterone, and many were stacking orals with injectables. Testosterone propionate, enanthate, and cypionate from the 30s, later to be joined by nandrolone. As Draper alluded to earlier, much of the innovation of training and nutrition for that era was derailed when guys could just take drugs to compensate. Top honors became more difficult for the drug-free bodybuilder to win, and by 1969, a November Iron Mag magazine declared that the race between natural and drug-using bodybuilders is over, as they cannot compete at the top level without drugs. The entire ethos of contest preparation changed, with guys formerly starting off lean and then putting on mass for a show, now gave way to using drugs 6 to 12 weeks before a contest to facilitate the simultaneous loss of fat and muscle gain. Cycles went from weeks to months, with many bodybuilders incorporating off-season cycles to assist in muscle gain. With the help of drugs' better nutrient partitioning, they could now increase their calories to gain and then use thyroid and diuretics to assist fat loss. As much as the industry leaders Hoffman and Weider wanted readers of their mags to believe in the efficacy of their supplements and gimmicks, Bruce Page in Iron Man magazine neatly summarized the final verdict over the hijacked direction of bodybuilding, quoting a top pro who was asked what protein he used. "Who needs protein when there's Dianabol around?" Now, this ends part 1 of my analysis on PEDs in the golden era. In part 2, I'll explore the 70s, including the cycles used by those bodybuilders in pumping iron. Now, if you enjoyed this video, please support my work by leaving a like and a comment. I really appreciate the support. And I would really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. Thanks again.